What is going on, alpha males? Welcome to Alpha Male Podcast, where we talk about what it means to be a man, made in the image of God, strong, dominant, and in control, making godly men strong and strong men godly. That's the mission statement here. Today is a much requested episode. Long time ago, back when I was the commander of a tactical team, and I've been reluctant to do it. And here's why. There's many, but there's a couple of big reasons why I'm not a law enforcement officer anymore. And I don't really want to get into that. I have shared that more with the patrons on a Patreon only episode. And there's a lot of politics and stuff that goes into that whenever you talk about law enforcement. I don't want to get into politics. But I'll try and do this show since it was requested and be a good servant to you, the audience. Do another episode on lessons learned in law enforcement. Personal lessons that you hopefully can apply to your life that are applicable without getting into all the politics of law enforcement. Now, I guess I should mention, with foregoing the lengthy bio, I have a background in law enforcement. LAPD, worked some of the nastiest streets in the country, worked regular assignment like patrol, worked more specialized assignments, fugitive recovery, warrant enforcement. I also worked with and for some three-letter government agencies I don't want to specify in more specialized roles, just to establish some street cred on the bona fides for me talking about this episode. Lessons learned. Crime is afoot. Crime is afoot. Now, obviously, if you're listening to this, you probably know that crime happens. Crime is a thing. But perhaps for you in your daily life, crime is not a normal thing. One thing I heard when I was a law enforcement officer was, I never thought it would happen to me. I never thought it would happen to me. As if somehow bad things only ever happen to other people. Burglaries, BFMVs, burglaries from motor vehicles, assault. As if somehow bad things only ever happened on TV or to other people. Of course you know that if you hear about a crime on TV, that was an actual real person, but that's kind of far removed from you and your reality. But let me smack you in the face with a cold, hard, frozen fish of reality. Crime is afoot. In your AO, in your area of operation. Now I worked LAPD, I worked in some of the nastiest streets in the country. Crime is definitely afoot there. But here's the thing. In other capacities, in other law enforcement roles, I worked in very small rural areas from time to time. Guess what? Crime is afoot there too. Crime is afoot. Crime is not just a thing that happens in, the inner city of Chicago. It's not just something that happens in Compton or Rampart. Crime is afoot in your area. Here's one thing you learn. Crime is not only afoot for a certain section of the population, it's how they make a living. It's what they do. And whether you're talking about something that's malum in se, evil by nature, or malum prohibitum, it's wrong because the government has said that they don't sanction this activity. For instance, murder is wrong. You shall not murder, malum in se. Or making moonshine. The government says it's okay to drink alcohol, it's okay to make alcohol, but if you make liquor, you need a license. And if you do it without a license, that's against the law. That's criminal. That's malum prohibitum. It's wrong because we say you didn't pay the fee, you didn't get the license, the permit, malum prohibitum. There's a certain section of the population that disregards one of those or both of those, either for the pursuance of enterprise, strictly to make money, or let's be honest, because they enjoy it, or they find it easier than a normal job, or whatever the case might be. But there's a certain section of the population, whether it be in Compton, whether it be Crips or Bloods, or whether it be in a small little backwoods town. Crime is afoot. Crime is active in your AO, in your area of operation. Crime is where you are. And you may not recognize it, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. It's like you may go to the ocean, to the beach, which I really love the ocean and the beach and swimming in the ocean. And you're probably not constantly thinking about there being sharks. Well, I come from a line of commercial fishermen. And you know what? They catch sharks. That's a big part of that area where we work, commercial shark fishing. And they catch sharks right off the beach where people swim and frolic around all the time. Because you can't see them, because you don't interact with them on a daily basis, doesn't mean that they're not there. Sharks are in the water. Crime is in your area. Period. And I guess being a cop, being part of my job to hunt down criminals and catch them, I got a little bit of dose of reality. I got to kind of put my head under the water. If you've ever been snorkeling or swimming with a mask, whether it's scuba diving or free diving, and you look on top from the beach and you look down and you see the ocean, but when you actually swim down, like if you've ever been diving off Catalina Island and you go down and there's a whole other world down there that's always happening that you're not aware of. Likewise, it can be in the criminal world. Maybe going on right underneath your nose. You just don't see it. But it's real and it's there. If we continue on in that predatory marine analogy, there are certain predators that don't pose much of a risk to you, right? Barracudas are around. But unless you're trying to hand feed one of them a sardine, probably not going to be an issue. Many predators have a normal set of prey. I'm not a marine biologist. But in general, I think a lot of ecosystems, the prime or preferred primary prey of a great white shark is a marine mammal, a seal, a sea lion, and so forth. Every once in a while, they'll snatch up a person. It's not their preferred prey. It's not what they normally prey on. It's not because they can't. Right? They can kill a person like that. They just generally don't. That's just not their general modus operandi, their method of operation. It's not what they normally prey on. Again, it doesn't mean they won't or they can't. Their normal prey is a seal. If you look at a seal, it's usually pretty aware that there are great white sharks in its AO. Right? They're pretty aware and on alert for that. If you look at an environment, let's say a certain part of LA, Southeast Division, the Southeast around Compton, a Crip's normal prey would be a Blood. A Blood's probably pretty aware that they're Crips operating in their AO. That doesn't mean that if you get off on the wrong freeway exit and make a couple of wrong turns late at night and find yourself in the wrong part of town, that they won't take a meal of opportunity, a target of opportunity, and take a bite out of you too. It's just not their normal modus operandi, method of operation. Likewise, a drug dealer, its primary prey is probably a drug user. They use them to get money. That's their modus operandi. That doesn't mean they're not operating around you. And that doesn't mean that sometimes the criminal element won't sometimes prey on things outside their normal prey or go outside their normal area of operation. Now, I think that analogy is somewhat useful, but it breaks down pretty quick because that's true for certain criminals in certain circumstances and certain categories of criminals, but some criminals just look for the low-hanging fruit. Their area of operation and their modus operandi might change based on the circumstances. Kind of like a rat, right? A rat doesn't really have a set. It might in a certain environment because that's all it has, but it'll eat all kinds of stuff, right? It'll eat trash. It'll eat insects. It'll eat dead things, carrion. It'll eat all kinds of stuff. Much more opportunistic. But kind of the overarching takeaway of that lesson from law enforcement is crime is afoot. There are sharks in the water. And a lot of times, a large portion of the population, I think, walks around with blinders on. And I recently had an interaction with somebody very close to me. And they grew up and were in what they considered a charming small town. And even by their own admission, there was a meth lab, they said, that burned down on the corner of their block. And there was a weed store right there on their block. And I don't have proof of this, but if I were a cop investigating narcotics activity, place 2 doors down, I would have looked at as investigating for narcotics activity. And shortly after I left them, that location, there was a shooting where a couple of people were shot at a 7-Eleven. And a lot of people, them and their family, were kind of taken back by that, as if that was some kind of surprise. It wasn't a surprise to me. And I think that's gleaning from a blessing that God gave me in law enforcement of knowing that crime is afoot. Unlike the analogy where you can just opt out of that marine ecosystem, you can't opt out because crime is a part of culture and society in your world. You can mitigate it by not going where there's heavy shark activity, but you're in the water, right? There is crime afoot. First, I want to open your eyes to that, and then we can talk a little bit about how to rectify it. A couple of quotes come to mind. Evil prevails when good men do nothing, and walk softly and carry a big stick. Walk softly and carry a big stick, I think, is part of big stick diplomacy, often accredited to Theodore Roosevelt. And to give credit where credit is due, I looked up the quote, I believe attributed to Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph in the world is that good men do nothing. Now, part of that walk softly and carry a big stick, Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Right? Swords are for defense. Swords are not for slicing bread. They're not for taking a splinter out of your foot. They're not for making a salad, right? They're for defense. They're for having for defense. Have defense. Have a means to defend yourself and stand up against evil. Reminds me of another quote attributed to Colonel Jeff Cooper. And I say attributed because I wasn't there and I didn't hear these men say it. By the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established, but often attributed to Jeff Cooper. Colonel Jeff Cooper said, an unarmed man can only flee from evil, and evil is not overcome by fleeing from it. Now, a sword is no good if you won't use it. You have to have a willing attitude, a willing heart. You have to have wisdom and discernment to know when to stand up and fight against evil. So you need wisdom. You also need courage to actually do it when the time comes. You need strength. Wisdom, strength, and courage are attributes of a warrior throughout history. From a Spartan, to a Greek, to a Roman, to a samurai, to a crusader, and modern-day crusaders. Wisdom, courage, and strength. And you'll find that all throughout the Bible. Do not be afraid, do not be afraid, do not be afraid. You're called to fear only one thing as a child of God, as a Christian. God and God alone. You're not to fear anything else. Do not be afraid. If God is for me, who can be against me? Carrying a weapon does not mean that you are afraid. It means that you are wise. You see the evil in the world, and you have the wisdom, the courage, and the strength to stand up against it. Now, I'm not going to knock any other thing, but I think a lot of people are into EDC, everyday carry, for the fidget factor, for the cool factor. Like, there's all kinds of what I would consider pretty impractical EDC stuff. And if that's how you want to spend your money and stuff, that's fine. I'm not here to put that down. If it's your money and you earned it lawfully, if you want a grown man version of a fidget spinner or whatever that is, rock on. But I like EDC for the practicality of it, for being ready, for watching and being ready. A knife, a handgun, a flashlight, a tourniquet, right? To watch and be ready. If you open your eyes and realize that crime is afoot, there are sharks in the water, right? That kind of ties into the mission statement for the podcast, to make godly men strong and strong men godly. Jesus tells his disciples to have swords. Even the angels wield swords. Now there's also a spiritual warfare that I don't want to neglect, which I will get to at the end of this podcast. But there is a spiritual warfare. There's also actual physical violence and evil things physically that one should be on guard against. A couple of things that might help you with this. Now, I do a whole other podcast called Gunfighter Life. So if you're into the tactical EDC stuff, I've even done episodes on here on EDC. I do a whole other podcast on guns, Gunfighter Life. I don't want to turn this into that. But some other ways to help with this issue. An area study. I think you'll admit by this point, hopefully, that there is crime afoot in your area. What kind of crime is afoot in your area? Put on that diving mask, that set of goggles, and put your head under the water and look around and see what kind of crime is afoot. Do an area study of your AO, your area of operation. What crime is afoot in your area? Most of this is open source intelligence. You can probably reach out to sources that are free and easy, especially in the internet age, of what crime is afoot in your area. I'm not telling you to join a gang and become a Crip so you can understand the inner workings and conflicts of Crip versus Blood. Well, what I'm telling you is to maybe look at crime maps of your area. A lot of times the departments in your area that have jurisdiction in your area, whatever kind of resources, maybe they're federal, county, city, whatever. Look for crime stats in your area, right? What are crime stats in your area? What are the crimes? Maybe I'm just picking random examples, right? I don't know where you live. Maybe it's burglary from motor vehicle. Maybe burglaries from motor vehicles are a thing that is common in your area. A good thing to know. All right, if we just use that random example. Don't leave stuff in plain sight. Again, as I mentioned, a lot of criminals just look for the low-hanging fruit. If they look in your car and see a wallet or your wife's purse, they're much more likely to smash out that window and you be the victim of a burglary from motor vehicle. Also, maybe be alert and on guard. Watch and be ready. Do you see somebody walking along peering in windows? Right? That's crime is afoot. And you may not even notice it if you're not aware that there's BFMVs in your area. But once you know that, you might actually have your eyes open and recognize, hey, that doesn't look right. It's at 10 o'clock at night and I've seen that guy look into 2 or 3 cars on different sides of the street. That's not normal. So area studies, knowing what crime is afoot in your area, knowing what, you may even be able to find out what the modus operandi is, how they normally do it. Is there a certain criminal element that behaves a certain way in your area? What are the crime trends in your area? What's the method of operation, the modus operandi? Sadly, in one of the large metro areas that I worked in, human trafficking was a big thing. Sadly, it was a big thing. And we learned certain things and cues to look for to help victims of human trafficking. But to be aware of that, you kind of have to know that that's a thing in your area. It's one thing to see a prostitute in a large metropolitan area, and that brings its own moral issues. But it's a far, far more insidious thing, I think, when you recognize that very likely may be a kidnapped victim of human trafficking, right? That takes it to a whole just darker place. It's a sad thing. Is that a thing in your area? And don't just say no, because hopefully you're not hanging out in an area where people go to get that kind of service. That doesn't mean it's not happening a block or 2 over. And it doesn't mean they're not looking to prey on targets of opportunity. That's a real thing that happens here in America all the time. And by God's grace. I know people listen to this from all other places, so whatever applies to you. But do an area study. Realize there is crime in your area. I am not Catholic. Part of this is not intended to be a criticism of Catholicism, but the Vatican City, right? I've been to Vatican City. There's probably certain crimes afoot in Vatican City. No matter where you are, there's probably crime afoot in your area of operation, right? I would just surmise that like purse snatching and snatch and grabs are probably pretty common, with a bunch of tourists walking around with their heads dug into a map or their phone or whatever in Vatican City from people all over the world. I would imagine there's certain crime trends in that area. And you should kind of open your eyes and see what crime is afoot in your area and what you can do. Okay, the next thing I want to transition and talk about, something that kind of opened my eyes, not just in law enforcement, but this showed me that it's not just a thing in a third world country or a collapsed, failed state or society, because I've seen it there too, but right here in America. Human beings have a tendency to be tribal, and you may not think of it in that kind of lens. You may not use that word, but that's the word that I'm going to use. Tribal. Human beings are inherently tribal. This is perhaps inherently more obvious, like if you go to the Middle East and you see the Bedouins. They have their own little tribes, their own extended family groups. I've never been to, Papua New Guinea, but I assume if I go there, I will see very much the same thing. But it's not just there. Bringing it around to law enforcement, right? If you go to, doesn't have to be a complete failed, collapsed society like I saw when we conquered, liberated Baghdad, Iraq, whatever you want to call what we did there. I'm not here to get into that, but at least not on this episode. But you can very much see tribal stuff going on there, but you can see it here in America too. Like, what is a Crip and a Blood, since we already used that example, what is that if not a tribe? What is MS-13 if not a tribe? I think a lot of times, especially it's, leveraged on the news, like racism between whites and blacks in America. Some real racism is if you go into the inner city in LA and see the Hispanic versus the black gangs, or prisons black versus Hispanic gangs. What would you call that if not a tribe? If not tribal? And kind of like confederacies and loose confederations, you have the Crips and the Bloods, which are two big categories, but you have all kinds of subcategories. Little subsections of this faction of the Crips and this faction of the Bloods in this area. What is that if not tribal? And I think at our nature, at our core, we're inherently tribal. If you look in the Bible, Israel and Judah, they are a specific people group called out by God. They also form the 12 tribes. Tribal. When they camped in tribes. I think humans are tribal by nature. And you might say, so what? What's the practical application here? I live in the suburbs, in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro people hive, whatever you want to call that entire area. Blue collar, middle class. What does that have to do with me? Well, I'd say, that's probably part of your tribe. Blue collar, middle class. If you're listening to this, I would surmise likely conservative, into guns and defense. That kind of identifies you as being part of a certain kind of tribe, whether you think of it that way or not. You might view other people through that lens, whether you realize it or not. When I think of it in terms of tribe, you may see somebody with a Bernie Sanders sticker and a hemp hoodie, wearing Birkenstocks, and think he's not part of, he's different to me, he's not part of my tribe. But I think it does kind of shape our view on the world and society as a whole, whether we realize it or not. And another lesson for this is I don't apologize for being a prepper. I'm probably going to leave that in. A prepper, being prepared, being into survival, a survivalist. I don't shy away from those terms. I don't like Orwellian newspeak and making terms off limits because somebody else decides that they mean something they don't actually mean. A survivalist, somebody that specializes in survival. By God's grace, He gives me the ability to eat food and breathe air. I like that. I like to continue to do that, whatever comes. I don't apologize for that. But in breakdowns of society, breakdowns, civil unrest, social unrest, things like that, which I have been through and seen, both foreign and domestic, which I've gotten into in other episodes. But people, I think, will revert back to being tribal. You might think of failed states as being in America. You might think of them as like being in Somalia or being in Baghdad when it fell, and they certainly are. But what is, Southeast LA? What is Rampart Division? What is, the south side of Chicago, if not the same thing, where culture and society is kind of broken down? If you look in those microcosms here in America today, in 2023, in the year of our Lord, 2023, I don't know when you're going to listen to this, there are tribal societies going on right now. I don't know, I wasn't Chicago PD, I don't know what gangs are active in Chicago, but I got to imagine there's entire communities broken up into little tribes, right? Norteños and Sureños, if you go to a different part of LA, but tribal. And confederacies, right? The Norteños and Sureños might join together if they're having a bigger turf war with the Crips and the Bloods. Even though in normal times the Crips and the Bloods would be totally at odds against each other. You kind of see that dynamic in those, politics in all kinds of human interaction all over the world. And you don't just see it there, you see it here in law enforcement in America today. And if society and culture breaks down, I think recognizing that it will go tribal and looking at that for yourself and being circumspect, and how, if and when will that tribal nature apply to you. And just like opening your eyes to crime afoot and sharks in the water, you may want to open your eyes to the tribalism in your area if you think that it may have any impact on your life now or in the future. Doing a study, tribalism throughout history, throughout cultures, looking at something like Dunbar's number. How tribes interact. What tribes are active in your area of operation right now? And if resources get scarce and those tribes go to exert authority over those resources, how is that going to affect you? Maybe even so circumspect that you look around and realize if you are in a tribe yourself, even if you don't call it that. If something were to go down, who would you identify with? Who would you band with? Who would be part of your tribe? Right? These things. And I didn't learn about tribes in law enforcement, but I saw tribal activity, in real time active here in America. And I think that it always is, and I think a lot of people are less aware of it. So that tribalism, I think, is a lesson learned there. The next one is a big one. Evil is real. Evil is real and is manifested every day in our world. Evil is real. Not just, people being criminals that are malum prohibitum, right? Not somebody selling moonshine without a license. Evil. Evil. Going against the law of God. Evil. What would you call it when somebody abducts a child and sells them into human trafficking, if not evil? And I'm not afraid to call that evil. I'm going to say, it's a mental illness. There's no such thing as truth and good or right and wrong. Whatever I think is right is right. And if somebody else thinks something is right, then it's right for them. No, that's New Age garbage. It's garbage. It's disgusting. There is absolute truth, there's absolute right and wrong, and there is evil in this world. Again, a man that kidnaps a minor and sells them into human trafficking. What is that if not evil? Somebody that physically tortures another human being who is too weak to fight back against them. And don't think that's something that only happens in a horror movie on TV. That happens in real life. People that cause other people physical pain and they themselves get enjoyment from it. What is that if not evil? And if you're the kind of man that won't stand up and condemn those things as evil, then you've either been so deluded by some garbage New Age worldview or you're just a coward. Those things are evil, and we should be standing up as men and calling those things evil. And when possible, we should stand up to fight against that evil. There is real evil in the world. Just like you may not be aware of that other crime that's going on, talking about being on top of the water and putting your head under the water and seeing there's a whole other thing going on. We are physical beings who live in an earthly tent here, but there are things that we can't see. There are spiritual things. There are angels and there are demons. There is good and there is evil. There is a battle, and you're part of that battle. And just like somebody can walk around with their head in their iPhone and, spend their time binge watching whatever's on Netflix and driving to a cubicle at work and keeping their other spare time on some social media app on their cell phone and never realize that there's crime afoot or evil going on in the world, but there is. And there's a spiritual war going on for you. You're part of it, whether you like it or not. It's been going on before you were born and breathed breath on this earth, and it'll be going on unless Jesus comes back in our lifetime after you've taken your last breath in this physical body, this temporary dwelling that you have. It's a war, and you should open your eyes to it. There is real, actual evil in this world. That's a big lesson that it's hard to, I don't know how you could deny that as a cop seeing things that you see. I'm not denying that there is some mental illness, but some things are just pure evil. We shouldn't close our eyes to it, especially not as men, especially not as alpha males. There is real evil in this world. With that, tactical tip of the day and the tactical verse of the day. Now, tactical tip of the day, some good crime indicators. One is if you see parts of a spark plug laying around broken glass. Now, you can use part of a spark plug to pretty easily, quickly, and somewhat quietly break out glass. And that can be used in burglaries or burglaries from motor vehicles. So if you see that, just be aware that there's probably that crime afoot. Also, drug activity. Syringes, spoons burnt on one side, little small glass pipes or little small glass tubes that I know as a pipe, but you may recognize as a pipe. But it looks like a little small glass tube and it looks like it's been heated, discolored. That's for hard drugs. And you might think, well, that doesn't apply to me. I don't use hard drugs. And good for you. I hope that you don't and continue not to. Just say no. But here's the thing. That tells you that people probably are doing them in your area. And if they really need those drugs, they may be willing to violate the 8th commandment and take from you to get resources to do said drugs. Just, tactical tips. Be aware of those kind of things. Keep your eyes open. Tactical verse of the day. Deuteronomy chapter 20. He shall say, Hear Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you victory. Reminds me of another verse. If God is for us, who can be against us? Also reminds me of another passage a verse David said to Solomon, Be strong and prove yourself a man. David was a man after God's own heart. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He sinned. But he was a man after God's own heart. He was a mighty warrior. He slayed man and beast. He said to his son, Be strong and prove yourself a man. With that, men, thanks for listening to Alpha Male Podcast. Have a blessed day.